Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Great Captains, showing the influence on the art of war of the campaigns of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Frederick, and Napoleon, by Theodore A. 6. Napoleon.
The career of Napoleon Bonaparte is so near to our own times and so commonly familiar that it is not essential to describe any of those operations which were, within the memory of some men yet living, the wonder and dread of Europe. In certain respects, Napoleon was the greatest of all soldiers. He had, to be sure, the history of other great captains to profit by. He had not to invent, he had only to improve. But he did for the military art what constitutes the greatest advance in any art. He reduced it to its most simple, most perfect form, and his and Frederick's campaigns furnished the final material from which Jomini and his followers could elucidate the science. For it has taken more than 2,000 years of the written history of war to produce a written science of war. I shall not touch upon Napoleon's life as statesman or lawgiver, nor on his services in carrying forward the results of the revolution toward its legitimate consequence, the equality of all men before the law. In these roles, no more useful man appears in the history of modern times. I shall look at him simply as a soldier. Napoleon's career is a notable example of the necessity of coexistent intellect, character, and opportunity to produce the greatest success in war. His strength distinctly rose through half his career, and as distinctly fell during the other half. His intellectual power never changed. The plan of the Waterloo campaign was as brilliant as any which he ever conceived. His opportunity here was equal to that of 1796. But his execution was marred by weakening physique, upon which followed a decline of that decisiveness which is so indispensable to the great captain. It will, perhaps, be interesting to trace certain resemblances between the opening of his first independent campaign in 1796 and his last one in 1815, to show how force of character won him the first and the lack of it lost him the last, and to connect the two campaigns by a thread of the intervening years of growth till 1808 and of decline from that time on. When Napoleon was appointed to the command of the Army of Italy, he had for the moment a serious problem. In this army were able and more experienced officers of mature powers and full of manly strength, who looked on this all but unknown, 27 years old, small, pale, untried commander-in-chief, decidedly askance. But Napoleon was not long in impressing his absolute superiority upon them all. They soon recognized the master hand. The army lay strung out along the coast from Loano to Savona, in a worse than bad position. The English fleet held the sea in its rear, and could make descents on any part of this long and ill-held line. Its communications lay in prolongation of the left flank over a single bad road, subject not only to interruption by the English, but the enemy, by forcing the Col di Tenda, could absolutely cut it off from France. The troops were in woeful condition. They had neither clothing nor rations. They were literally heroes in rags. On the further side of the maritime Alps lay the Austrian general Beaulieu, commanding a superior army equally strung out from Mont Blanc to Genoa. His right wing consisted of the Piedmontese army under Colli at Siva. His center was at Casello. With his left, he was reaching out to join hands with the English at Genoa. Kellerman faced, in the passes of the Alps, a force of 25,000 Sardinians, but for the moment was out of the business. Napoleon spent but few days in providing for his troops, and then began to concentrate on his right flank at Savona. He knew that his own position was weak, but he also divined from the reports brought in from the outposts that the enemy's was worse. From the very start, he enunciated in his strategic plan the maxim he obeyed through life. Move upon your enemy in one mass on one line, so that when brought to battle you shall outnumber him, and from such a direction that you shall compromise him. This is, so to speak, the motto of Napoleon's success. All perfect art is simple, and after much complication or absence of theoretical canons from ancient times to his, Napoleon reduced strategy down to this beautifully simple, rational rule. Nothing in war seems at first blush so full of risk as to move into the very midst of your enemy's several detachments. No act in truth is so safe, if his total outnumbers yours, and if you outnumber each of his detachments. for, as always, seemed to be more clear to Napoleon and Frederick than to any of the other great captains, you can first throw yourself upon any one of them, beat him, and then turn upon the next. But to do this requires audacity, skill, and above all, tireless legs. And success is predicated in all cases on the assumption that God is on the side of the heaviest battalions. So Napoleon, who was very familiar with the topography of Italy, at once determined to strike Beaulieu's center, and by breaking through it, to separate the 25,000 Piedmontese in the right wing from the 35,000 Austrians in the left wing, so that he might beat each separately with his own 37,000 men. Beaulieu's reaching out toward Genoa facilitated Napoleon's maneuver, for the Austrian would have a range of mountains between him and his center under Argenteau, whom he had at the same time ordered forward on Savona via Montanate. Napoleon's maneuver was strategically a rupture of Beaulieu's center. Tactically, it first led to an attack on the right of Argenteau's column. The details of the maneuver it would consume hours to follow. Suffice it to say that by a restless activity, which, barring Frederick, had not been seen in war since the days of Caesar, Napoleon struck blow after blow, first upon Argenteau, throwing him back easterly, then on Calais, throwing him back westerly, absolutely cut the Allies in two, fought half a dozen battles in scarce a greater number of days, and in a short fortnight had beaten the enemy at all points, had captured 15,000 prisoners, 50 guns, and 21 flags. Still, the problem was serious. Beaulieu, if active, could shortly concentrate 100,000 men. Napoleon must allow him not a moment of breathing spell. He issued a proclamation to his troops, which sounds like the blare of a trumpet. It set ablaze the hearts of his men. It carried dread to his enemies, and Napoleon followed it up by a march straight on Turin. Alarmed and disconcerted, the King of Sardinia sued for peace. Napoleon concluded an armistice with him, and thus saw himself disembarrassed of the enemy's right wing and free to turn on the left under Beaulieu. His columns were at once launched on Alexandria, and by his skillful maneuvers and unparalleled alertness, he soon got the better of the Austrians. He had at a stroke made himself the most noted general of Europe. The rest of the campaign was equally brilliant and successful. Napoleon had shown his army that he commanded not by the mere commission of the Directory, but by the divine right of genius. He had not only taken advantage of every error of his opponents, but had so acted as to make them commit errors, and those very errors of which he had need. His army had been far from good. But I believe, says Jomini, that if Napoleon had commanded the most excellent troops, he would not have accomplished more, even as Frederick, in the reversed case, would not have accomplished less. We recognize in this first independent campaign of Napoleon the heroic zeal of Alexander, the intellectual subtlety of Hannibal, the reckless self-confidence of Caesar, the broad method of Gustavus, the heart of oak of Frederick. But one fault is discoverable, and this, at the time, was rather a virtue. Napoleon underrated his adversary. By and by, this error grew in the wrong direction and became a strong factor in his failures. Through the rest of this campaign, which numbered the victories of Lodi, Castiglione, Bassano, Arcole, the most noteworthy thing except his own personal diligence is the speed with which Napoleon maneuvered his troops. To state an instance, from September 5th to September 11th, 6 days, Napoleon's men fought one pitched battle and 2 important combats, and marched Massena 88 miles, Augereau 96 miles, and the other corps less distances. He was far from being uniformly lucky. He had many days of serious backsets, but whenever luck ran in his favor, he seized it and made it useful. When against him, he gamely strove to stem its tide. If fortune frowned, he wooed her unceasingly till she smiled again. The campaign, which began in April 1796, really lasted till April 1797. Napoleon pushed the Austrians out of Italy and well back towards Vienna. His triumphs culminated in the brilliant victory of Rivoli and his success at the Truce of Leoben. At Rivoli, with 30,000 men, Napoleon defeated the enemy and captured 20,000 prisoners. The men who had left Verona and fought at San Michele on the 13th of January marched all night to Rivoli, there conquered on the 14th, and again marching to Mantua, some 30 miles, compelled Provera to lay down his arms on the 15th. Napoleon could rightfully boast to have equaled Caesar in speed of foot. The men of the Revolution had cut loose from 18th century methods of warfare by rising en masse and putting the personal element into the scale. But it was reserved for Napoleon to substitute a new method for the old. From Nice to Leoben, he showed the world what modern war can do. He made himself independent of magazines, as Frederick had done but rarely. With a smaller army, he always had more men at the point of contact. This was Napoleon's strongest point. He divined what his enemy would do, not from his tent, but from the saddle, seeing with his own eyes and weighing all he saw and heard. He was every day and all day long in motion. He rode unheard of distances. He relied on no one but himself, as, with his comparatively small army, he could well do. And correctly seeing and therefore correctly gauging circumstances, he had the courage to act upon his facts. He sought battle as the result of every maneuver. The weight of his intellect and his character were equally thrown into all he did, and his abnormal ambition drove him to abnormal energy. In this, his first campaign, and in 1 year, with moderate forces, he had advanced from Nice to within 80 miles of Vienna, and had wrung a peace from astonished Austria. Napoleon next undertook the Egyptian campaign. His ambition had grown with success, but matters in France were not in a condition of which he could personally avail, and he believed he could increase his reputation and power by conquests in the East. His imagination was boundless. Perhaps no great soldier can be free from imagination, or its complement, enthusiasm. Napoleon had it to excess, and in many respects it helped him in his hazardous undertakings. At this time, he dreamed himself another Alexander conquering the Eastern world, thence to return, as Alexander did not, with hordes of soldiers disciplined by himself and fanatically attached to his person, to subjugate all Europe to his will. The narration of this campaign of 16 months may be made to sound brilliant. Its result was miscarriage. It is full of splendid achievements and marred but by one mishap, the siege of Acre. But the total result of the campaign was failure to France, though gain to Napoleon, who won renown, and abandoning his army when the campaign closed, returned to Paris at a season more suited to his advancement. Napoleon's military conduct in this campaign shows the same marvelous energy, the same power of adapting means to end, of keeping all his extraordinary measures secret, the better to impose on the enemy by their sudden development, the same power over men. But the discipline of the army was disgraceful. The plundering which always accompanied Napoleon's movements, for, unlike Gustavus and Frederick, he believed in allowing the soldier freedom beyond bounds if only he would march and fight, was excessive. The health of the army was bad, its deprivations so great that suicide was common to avoid suffering, which was worse. And yet Napoleon, by his unequaled management, kept this army available as a tool, and an excellent one. Napoleon now became first consul. The campaign of 1800 was initiated by the celebrated crossing of the Alps. This feat of itself can no more be compared, as it has been, to Hannibal's great achievement, nor indeed to Alexander's crossing the Paropamisus, than a Pullman excursion to Salt Lake City can be likened to Albert Sidney Johnston's terrible march across the plains in 1857. Napoleon's crossing was merely an incident deftly woven into a splendid plan of campaign. From Switzerland, a geographical salient held by them, the French could debouch at will into Italy or Germany. Melas, the Austrian general in Italy, had his eyes fixed upon Massena in Genoa. A large reserve army was collected by Napoleon in France, while Moreau pushed toward the Danube. Melas naturally expected that the French would issue from Provence and kept his outlook towards that point. When Napoleon actually descended from the great St. Bernard upon his rear, he was as badly startled as compromised. This splendid piece of strategy was followed up with Napoleon's usual restless push and culminated in the Battle of Marengo. This was at first a distinct Austrian victory, but good countenance, Melas's neglect to pursue his gain, and Napoleon's ability to rally and hold his troops until absent Desaix could rejoin him turned it into an overwhelming Austrian defeat. And Napoleon, by the direction given to his mass, had so placed Melas that defeat meant ruin. He was glad to accept an armistice on Napoleon's own terms. This superb campaign had lasted but a month, and had been characterized by the utmost dash and clearness of perception. Again, Napoleon's one mass projected on one properly chosen line had accomplished wonders. Napoleon once said to Jomini, "The secret of war lies in the secret of communications. Keep your own and attack your enemies in such a way that a lost battle may not harm you. A battle won may ruin your adversary. Seize your enemy's communications and then march to battle." Napoleon's success came from study of the situation. His art was founded on an intimate knowledge of all the facts, coupled with such reasoning power as enabled him to gauge correctly what his enemy was apt to do. Without the art, the study would be useless. But the art could not exist apart from study. After Marengo, there were 5 years of peace. These, and the 4 years between Wagram and the Russian campaign, were the only 2 periods of rest from war in Napoleon's career. Succeeding this came the memorable Austerlitz campaign. Napoleon had had for some months 3 of his best officers in Germany, studying up topography, roads, bridges, towns, in the Black Forest region, and toward the Tyrol and Bohemia. To thus make himself familiar with the status was his uniform habit. Napoleon, now emperor, was at Boulogne, threatening, and perhaps at times half-purposing an invasion of England. He commanded the best army he ever had. The Austrians, not supposing him ready, inundated Bavaria with troops without waiting for their allies, the Russians, and marched up the Danube to the Iller under Field Marshal Mack. Napoleon put an embargo on the mails, broke up from Boulogne at 24 hours' notice, and reached the vicinity of the enemy with an overwhelming force before Mack was aware of his having left the sea. His line of march was about Mack's right flank, because this was the nearest to Boulogne and gave him a safe base on the Confederate German provinces. So well planned was the maneuver, so elastic in its design for change of circumstances, that it fully succeeded, step for step, until Mack was surrounded at Ulm and surrendered with his 30,000 men. Here again we find the Napoleonic rule fairly overwhelming Mack with superior numbers. Except in 1796 and 1814, Napoleon always had more men than the enemy on the field at the proper time. "They ascribe more talent to me than to others," he observed. "And yet to give battle to an enemy I am in the habit of beating, I never think I have enough men. I call to my aid all that I can unite." The chart herewith given of the grand maneuver of Ulm is so simple as to suggest no difficulties of execution. But there is probably nothing in human experience which taxes strength, intellect, judgment, and character to so great a degree as the strategy and logistics of such a movement, unless it be the tactics of the ensuing battle. The difficulties are, in reality, gigantic. Napoleon headed direct for Vienna, and on the way absolutely lived on the country. In the movements and wars of invasion conducted by the emperor, there are no magazines. It is a matter for the commanding generals of the corps to collect the means of victualling in the countries through which they march, writes Berthier to Marmont. Napoleon took Vienna and marched out towards Brünn, where the Austrians and Russians had concentrated. Here he was far from secure, if equal talent had been opposed to him. But he took up a position near Austerlitz, from which he could retreat through Bohemia, if necessary, and, calmly watching the enemy and allowing several chances of winning an ordinary victory to pass, he waited, with an audacity which almost ran into braggadocio, for the enemy to commit some error from which he could wrest a decisive one. And this the Allies did, as Napoleon divined they would do. They tried to turn his right flank and cut him off from Vienna. Napoleon massed his forces on their center and right, broke these in pieces, and won the victory of which he was always most proud. Napoleon's conduct here showed distinctly a glint of what he himself so aptly calls the divine part of the art. There is always a corresponding danger in every plan which is of the kind to compass decisive results. In this case, Napoleon risked his right wing. But to judge how much it is wise to risk, and to guess just how much the enemy is capable of undertaking, is a manifestation of genius. The era of the great battles of modern war dates from Austerlitz. Marengo was rather 2 combats than one great battle. Frederick's battles were wonders of tactics and courage, but they differ from the Napoleonic system. In Frederick's battles, the whole army was set in motion for one maneuver at one time to be executed under the management of the chief. If the maneuver was interrupted by unforeseen events, the battle might be lost. In Napoleon's system, The center might be broken, and the wings still achieve victory. One wing might be crushed while the other destroyed the enemy. A bait was offered the enemy by the exhibition of a weak spot to attract his eye, while Napoleon fell on the key point with overwhelming odds. But in this system, the control passed from the hand of the leader. All he could do was to project a corps in a given direction at a given time. Once set in motion, these could not readily be arrested. Such a system required reserves much more than the old method. Battles are only won by strengthening the line at a critical moment, says Napoleon. Once in, Napoleon's corps worked out their own salvation. He could but aid them with his reserves. There is a magnificence of uncertainty and risk, and corresponding genius in the management of the battles of Napoleon. But for purely artistic tactics, they do not appeal to us, as do Frederick's. The motif of Alexander's battles is more akin to Napoleon's, that of Hannibal's to Frederick's. It has been said that Napoleon never considered what he should do in case of failure. The reverse is more exact. Before delivering a battle, Napoleon busied himself little with what he would do in case of success. That was easy to decide. He busied himself markedly with what could be done in case of reverse. Like all great captains, Napoleon preferred lieutenants who obeyed instead of initiating. He chafed at independent action. This was the chief's prerogative. But as his armies grew in size, he gave his marshals charge of detail under general instructions from himself. Dependence on Napoleon gradually sapped the self-reliance of more than one of his lieutenants. And though there are instances of noble ability at a distance from control, most of his marshals were able tacticians rather than great generals. Napoleon grew impatient of contradiction or explanation, and he sometimes did not learn or was not told of things he ought to know. He was no longer so active. Campaigning was a hardship. His belief in his destiny became so strong that he began to take greater risks. Such a thing as failure did not exist for him. His armies were increasing in size, and railroads and telegraphs at that day did not hasten transportation and news. The difficulties he had to contend with were growing fast. These things had the effect of making Napoleon's military plans more magnificent, more far-reaching. But all the less could he pay heed to detail, and from now on one can, with some brilliant exceptions, perceive more errors of execution. In the general conception, he was greater than ever, and this balanced the scale. His ability to put all his skill into the work immediately in hand was marvelous. But with a vast whole in view, the parts were, perhaps of necessity, lost sight of. The campaigns of 1806 and 1807 were in sequence. To move on the Prussians, who, under the superannuated Duke of Brunswick, were concentrated in Thuringia, Napoleon massed on his own right, disgarnishing his left, turned their left, in this case their strategic flank, because the maneuver cut them off from Berlin and their allies, the Russians, and with overwhelming vigor fell on the dawdling enemy at Jena and Auerstedt. The Prussians had remained stationary in the art of war, where they had been left by Frederick, and had lost his burning genius. It was at the outset of this campaign that Jomini handed in to Marshal Ney, his chief, a paper showing what Napoleon must necessarily do if he would beat the Prussians and cut them off from their approaching allies. He alone had divined the strategic secrets of the emperor. In this campaign, we plainly see the growth of risk, commensurate within the magnitude of plan, but we also recognize the greater perfection of general intuitions, the larger plan and method. Details had to be overlooked, but the whole army was held in the emperor's hand, like a battalion in that of a good field officer. In 48 hours, his 200,000 men could be concentrated at any one point. And the very essence of the art of war is to know when you may divide, to impose on the enemy, subsist, pursue, deceive, and to know how to divide, so that you may concentrate before battle can occur. Again, Napoleon had carried out his principle of moving on one line in one mass on the enemy, and a few great soldiers began to see that there was a theory in this. Jomini first grasped its full meaning and showed that only battle crowns the work. Without it, a general is merely uncovering his own communications. Victory is essential to the success of such a plan. Napoleon pushed restlessly in on the enemy. "While others are in council, the French army is on the march," quoth he. In the Austerlitz and Jena campaigns, Napoleon's maneuver was so admirably conceived that he kept open two lines of retreat, which he could adapt to the enemy's evolutions. At Austerlitz, via Vienna and Bohemia, at Jena, still more secure lines on the Rhine and on the Main or Danube. This is a distinct mark of the perfection of the plans. The succeeding Friedland campaign has several items of interest. At his first contact with the Russians, Napoleon, instead of sticking to his uniform plan of one mass on one line, tried to surround his enemy before he knew where the tactical decision of the campaign would come. Result: a thrust in the air by one corps, another did not reach the appointed place, a third met unexpected and superior forces, and the enemy broke through the net. Napoleon seemed to be experimenting. The captain of 1796, Ulm, Jena, is for the moment unrecognizable. The Russians attacked Napoleon in his winter quarters, and the bloody and indecisive Battle of Eylau resulted, where for the first time Napoleon met that astonishing doggedness of the Russian soldier, on which Frederick had shattered his battalions at Kunersdorf. Later came the victory of Friedland. Napoleon's order for this day is a model for study. Every important instruction for the battle is embraced in the order. Details are left to his lieutenants. Only the time of launching the first attack is reserved to the chief. But the strategy of the Friedland campaign was not so crisp. The true maneuver was to turn the Russian left, their strategic flank, and throw them back on the sea. Napoleon turned their right to cut them off from Königsberg. It was mere good luck that Friedland ended the campaign. Even after defeat, the enemy could have escaped. In the Spanish campaign of the winter of 1807-8, Napoleon reverted to his 1796 maneuver of breaking the enemy's center. But Napoleon had undertaken what could not be accomplished: the subjugation of Spain. His own strategy and the tactics of his marshals were both brilliant and successful. He could have compelled a peace, had such been the object. But to subdue a people fanatically fighting for their homes in a mountainous country is practically impossible by any means short of extermination. It was in the political, not the military, task that Napoleon failed. While Napoleon was struggling in Spain, Austria deemed the occasion good again to assert herself. This gave Napoleon an opportunity of leaving to his lieutenants a game he already saw he could not win, but in which he had achieved some brilliant openings, and hurry to fields on which he felt a positive superiority. His army and allies were already on the scene. Berthier was in charge, and to him Napoleon had given full and explicit instructions. But Berthier, though a good chief of staff, had no power to grasp a strategic situation. By not obeying orders, he had, by the time Napoleon arrived, muddled the problem, and instead of concentrating behind the Lech, had got Davout's corps pushed out to Ratisbonne, where it was liable to be cut off. Napoleon was in perilous case. But, by a beautiful and rapid series of maneuvers, in which he cut the enemy in two, he wrought victory out of threatening defeat. He was justly proud of this. The greatest military maneuvers that I have ever made, and on which I most flatter myself, took place at Eckmühl, and were immensely superior to those of Marengo or other actions which preceded or followed them. It is the rapidity and suddenness of these maneuvers which distinguished them from 1805. There was a regular plan, here a constant series of surprises and changes. In making his plans, Napoleon never began by, "What can the enemy do?" But he first sought to place his army in the best position, and then asked, "What now can the enemy do?" This gave him the initiative, but his plan was always elastic enough to bend to what the enemy might do. He never made plans colored by the enemy's possibilities. He chose his own plan intelligently, according to the geography, topography, and existing conditions, and made it elastic enough to be equal to the enemy's. The mind of a general should be like the glass of a telescope in sharpness and clearness, and never conjure up pictures. The elasticity of Napoleon's Eckmühl plan is well shown by his ability to turn threatening disaster into brilliant success. During all these days, Napoleon was tremendously active. He was personally at the important points. He hardly ate or slept. His body was governed entirely by his will. The soldier of 1796 was again afoot, but he was well and hearty. The lapse he now made is all the more singular. The Archduke Charles had been beaten at Eckmühl and was retiring into Ratisbon to cross the Danube. Napoleon neglected to pursue. They say he was persuaded by his marshals that the troops were too tired. For the first time in his life, he succumbed to an obstacle. Genius consists in carrying out a plan despite obstacles, and in finding few or no obstacles, he once said. Failure to pursue may come from the difficulty of leaving one's magazines, as in Frederick's era, or because the captain is exhausted, as well as the troops. But if the captain wants to pursue, the troops can always do so. If the enemy can fly, the victor can follow. Some part of the army is always in condition to march. Jomini says that if Napoleon had here pursued like the Prussians after Waterloo, it would have greatly modified the campaign. As it was, the Archduke made good his escape. Napoleon had broken in between the two wings of the Austrian army, but he had not crippled the one before turning against the other. So that when he reached Vienna on the heels of the left, he found ready to meet him the right wing, which he ought to have crushed beyond so quick recovery at Ratisbon. This failure to pursue is the first symptom of a habit which from now on is more observably of not utilizing every advantage. Then followed the crossing of the Danube at Lobau and the battles around Aspern and Essling, which terminated with defeat and great loss. The Archduke was on hand, received in overwhelming numbers that part of the French army which crossed. The bridges were broken behind the French, and a disastrous retreat to Lobau followed. Napoleon's difficulties were growing apace with the size of his armies, and he was now opposed by abler men. But it also seems as if occasional fits of apathy or impatience of exertion were growing on him. His splendid energy at Eckmühl did not continue. Details received less personal attention. He was more rarely at the front. He began to rely on the eyes of others more than, with his ancient vigor, he would have done, despite his dictum that a general who sees through the eyes of others will never be in condition to command an army as it should be commanded. Until battle actually opened, he lacked his old enthusiasm. After the first gun, he was himself again. But his method of conducting war was no longer so crisp as of yore. He was more daring than careful. He relied on his luck and strove to cover errors of omission by stupendous blows. He was suffering from not having about him a well-educated, properly selected staff, each member drilled in his specific duties. Till now, Napoleon had been his own staff, but with lessening activity, he had no one on whose eyes and judgment he could rely. The general staff is so organized that one cannot see ahead at all by its means, said he in the next campaign. Still, it must constantly be borne in mind that 150,000 men cannot be commanded as readily as 40,000. And Napoleon's breadth of view, his power of grasping the tout ensemble, were still present in greater measure. And when he chose, he could summon up all his old spirit. Succeeding this defeat were the skillful preparations for a new crossing and battle, the putting over from Lobau of 150,000 men and 400 guns in one night, and the victory of Wagram. Truly a marvelous performance. The strength of mind and constancy displayed by Napoleon on Lobau recalls the elastic courage of Alexander when, cut off from his communications, he turned upon the Persians at Issus. But after Wagram, the Austrians retired in good order, and Napoleon did not pursue. It was no doubt a difficult task, but with the inspiration of his earlier days, he would certainly have pushed the Archduke home, or lost the game. He forgot the principles which had made him what he was, in not following up the retreat. To other and even great generals, this criticism could not apply. But Napoleon has created a measure by which himself must be tried, and which fits but a limited group. In 1805, he said, "One has but a certain time for war. I shall be good for it but 6 years more. Then even I shall have to stop." Was Napoleon's best term drawing to a close? Or was it that the Archduke Charles was not a Wurmser or a Mack? In Napoleon's battles, tactical details are made to yield to strategic needs. Frederick generally chose his point of attack from a strictly tactical standpoint. Napoleon did not appear to consider that there were such things as tactical difficulties. He always moved on the enemy as seemed to him strategically desirable, and with his great masses he could readily do so. The result of Napoleon's battles was so wonderful just because he always struck from such a strategic direction as to leave a beaten enemy no kind of loophole. But Napoleon would have been more than human if his extraordinary successes had not finally damaged his character. It is but the story of Alexander with a variation. In the beginning, he was, after securing strategic value, strenuous to preserve his tactical values. By and by, he began to pay less heed to these. Stupendous successes bred disbelief in failure. Carelessness resulted, then indecision. Those historians who maintain that Napoleon succumbed solely to the gigantic opposition his status in Europe had evoked can show good reasons for their belief, for Napoleon's task was indeed immense. But was he overtaxed more than Hannibal, Caesar, or Frederick? In the Russian campaign, 1812, Napoleon's original idea was to turn the Russian right, but finding the Russian position further north than he expected, he resorted to breaking the Russian center. It here first became a question whether the rule of one mass on one line, distinctly sound with smaller armies, will hold good with the enormous armies of 1812 or of modern days. Whether the mere maneuver may not become so difficult of execution as to open the way to the destruction of the entire plan by a single accident. Certainly its logistics grow to a serious problem with a force beyond 200,000 men. And it seems probable that when armies much exceed this figure, the question of feeding, transportation, and command, even with railroads and telegraph, make concentric operations more available. And the fact that even Napoleon could not, in the absence of a thoroughly educated staff and perfectly drilled army, obtain good results from the handling of such enormous forces, gives prominence to the value of the Prussian idea of placing greater reliance on an army drawn from the personal service of the people and made perfect in all its details from the ranks up than on the genius of a single general. The entire plan of the Russian campaign was consistent and good. The Bonaparte of 1796 would probably have carried it through, despite its unprecedented difficulties. But its execution was seriously marred by the absence of Napoleon at the front and the want of his ancient decisiveness. To be sure, he had nearly 500,000 men to command and feed, but he was no longer the slim, nervously active, omnipresent man. He was corpulent, liked his ease, and shunned bad weather. This want appears in his long stay in Wilna, his failure to put his own individuality into the details of the advance, his now relying on his lieutenants, whom he had never trained, and some of whom were unable to rely on themselves. Napoleon began to draw his conclusions, not from personal observation, but from assumed premises. He had from the beginning the habit of underrating the enemy's forces. It now grew to be a rule with him to take 1/3 off from what the enemy really had and double his own forces in order to encourage his subordinates. This exaggerated reckoning could not but lead to evil. There is none of Frederick's straightforward dependence on his own brain and his army's courage. The king's frankness stands out in high relief against Napoleon's simulation. But we must constantly bear in mind that Napoleon led an army of unprecedented size, made up of different nationalities, in a limitless territory, and that his difficulties were enormous. It should be noted that Alexander's largest army in the field numbered 135,000 men, Hannibal's less than 60,000, Caesar's about 80,000. Gustavus never reached 80,000 men. Frederick had to parcel out his forces so that of his 150,000 men, he rarely could personally dispose of more than 50,000 in one body. Napoleon carried 360,000 men into Russia. This is not a final measure of the task, but it stakes out its size. Some of Napoleon's Russian maneuvers are fully up to the old ones. The manner of the attempt to turn the Russian left at Smolensk and seize their communications so as to fight them at a disadvantage is a magnificent exhibition of genius. But at the last moment he failed. The spirit of his plan was to seize the communications of his opponent and force him to fight. The letter was to seize Smolensk. When he reached Smolensk, the Russians had retired to the east of the city. Napoleon apparently overlooked the spirit of his plan, and though he could easily have done so, he did not cut the Russians off by a tactical turning movement. He was not personally where he needed to be, on the right, but remained at his headquarters. It may be claimed that the commander of so huge an army must necessarily remain at central headquarters. It is rather true that his administrative aides should be there. and he at the point of greatest importance. At Smolensk, theoretically and practically, this was the right, and operations at this point were entrusted to by no means the best of his subordinates. Napoleon's intellect was still as clear as ever. It was his physique and his power of decision which were weakening. Even allowing the utmost to all the difficulties of the situation, if tried by the rule of 1796 or 1805, this seems to be indisputable. When Napoleon did not bring on a battle at Smolensk, the Russian campaign had become a certain failure, for it was there settled that he could not reach Moscow with a force sufficient to hold himself. He had crossed the Niemen with 363,000 men. At Moscow, he could have no more than 100,000. Arrived at Smolensk, he was called on to face retreat, which was failure, or an advance to Moscow, which was but worse failure deferred. Almost sure annihilation. This seems clear enough from the military standpoint. But Napoleon advanced to Moscow, relying largely on the hope that the Russians would sue for a peace. For this dubious hope of the statesman, Napoleon committed an undoubted blunder as a captain. It is hard to divorce the statesman from the soldier. All great captains have relied on statecraft, and properly so. But such was the purely military syllogism. Much has been written about Napoleon's failure to put the guard in at Borodino. Under parallel conditions at an earlier day, he would certainly have done so. That he did not is but one link more in the growing chain of indecisiveness. But had he done so, and won a more complete victory, would it have made any eventual difference? Smolensk was his last point of military safety. Even had he been able to winter in Russia, it is not plain how spring would have bettered his case, in view of the logistic difficulties and of the temper of the Russian emperor and people. Time in this campaign was of the essence. Once or twice on the terrible retreat, Napoleon's old fire and decision came to the fore, but during the bulk of it, he was apparently careless of what was happening. He habitually left to his generals all but the crude direction of the outlying corps. The contrast between Napoleon in this disaster and Napoleon after raising the siege of Acre, or after the defeat at Aspern and Essling, is marked. He did not oppose his old countenance to misfortune. After this campaign, in which the grand army of 500,000 men was practically annihilated, Napoleon showed extraordinary energy in raising new troops, and actually put into the field, the succeeding spring, no less than 350,000 men. They were not the old army, but they were so many men. Napoleon understood this. We must act with caution, not to bring bad troops into danger, and be so foolish as to think that a man is a soldier. He had 1,300 guns. Poor soldiers need much artillery. The lack of good officers was the painful feature. The few old ones who were left were ruined by bad discipline. The new ones were utterly inexperienced. In the campaign of 1813, Napoleon showed all his old power of conception. The intellectual force of this man never seemed overtaxed. But the lack of resolution became still more marked. He began by winning 2 battles, Lutzen and Bautzen, in which he freely exposed himself and worked with all his old energy to lend his young troops confidence. He was then weak enough to enter into an armistice with the Allies. This was a singularly un-Napoleonic thing to do. He had turned the enemy's right and was strategically well placed. It was just the time to push home. If the reasons he alleged, want of cavalry and fear of the dubious position of Austria, were really the prevailing ones, Napoleon was no longer himself, for his wonderful successes hitherto had come from bold disregard of just such things. Napoleon here shows us how often fortune is of a man's own making. So long as he would not allow circumstances to dictate to him, fortune was constant. When he began to heed adverse facts, we see first indecisive victories, then half successes, and by we shall see failure and destruction. The operations about and succeeding Dresden show a vacillation which contrasts with the intellectual vigor. For the first time, Napoleon conducted a defensive campaign. He studied his chances of an offensive and cast them aside for reasons which would not have weighed a moment with him in 1805. And yet the defensive against his concentrically advancing enemies was no doubt the best policy. It shows Napoleon's judgment to have been better than ever. After this brilliant victory, Napoleon ordered a pursuit, which he ought to have made effective, across the Erzgebirge, but without issuing definite instructions. Sickness forbade the personal supervision he had expected to give. Troops intended to sustain the advanced corps were diverted from this duty by a sudden change of purpose. Here was, as Gemini says, without contradiction, one of Napoleon's gravest faults. But Napoleon had got used to seeing things turn in his favor until he deemed constant personal effort unnecessary. Decreasing strength had limited his activity. Great exertion was irksome. The immediate result of this ill-ordered operation was the destruction of a corps. The secondary result, the re-encouragement of the Allies, whose morale had been badly shaken by 3 defeats, and whose main army he should have followed into Bohemia and broken up. The grand result was loss of time, which to Napoleon was a dead loss, a new advance of the Allies, and the Battle of Leipzig. During all this time, while Napoleon's execution was weak compared to his old habit, his utterances and orders showed the clearest, broadest conception of what was essential. But he was no longer the man who used to gallop 40 to 60 miles a day to use his eyes. Even at Leipzig, he exhibited at times his old power. When defeat was certain, he lapsed into the same indifference he had shown on the Russian retreat. Nothing now, in a military sense, could save Napoleon, except to concentrate all his forces into one body and maneuver against the Allies with his old vigor. But the Emperor Napoleon could not bear to give up Italy, Belgium, Spain, as General Bonaparte had given up Mantua to beat the enemy at Castiglione, and he committed the grievous mistake of not concentrating all his forces for the defense of France. The campaign around Paris is a marvel of audacious activity, though indeed it did not bring up any of the larger intellectual problems of Marengo, Ulm, or Jena. If Napoleon had done half as good work with the larger army he might have had, there is scarce a doubt but that he would have gone far towards peace with honor. As it was, he was crushed by numbers. But no words can too highly phrase his military conduct within its limits in this brief campaign. There is but one mistake: the underrating of his enemy, the misinterpretation of manifest facts. The Waterloo Campaign, 1815, as already said, bears marked resemblance to that of 1796. The details of Waterloo are so well known that only the reasons will be noted which appear to make Napoleon's first so great a success and his last so great a failure. At the beginning of June, Napoleon had available for Belgium, where he proposed to strike the Allied forces, 110,000 foot and 13,500 horse. In Belgium were Wellington, covering Brussels with 95,000 men, and Blücher lying from Charleroi to Namur with 124,000. Napoleon was superior to either, inferior to both together. He chose against these Allied armies the same offensive maneuver he had employed against Beaulieu and Colli, a strategic breaking of their center so as to separate them and attack each one separately. The controlling reasons were the same. The Allies were of different nationalities, and each had a different base, as well as varying interests. If cut in two, they no doubt would retire eccentrically, of which Napoleon could take immediate advantage. The key to the whole problem was the exhibition by him of foresight, boldness, and rapid action. The plan could not be better. He concentrated on Charleroi. From here led 2 pikes, one to Brussels, which was Wellington's line of advance and retreat, one to Liège, which was Blücher's. Wellington and Blücher were connected by the Namur-Nivelle road, which cut the other pikes at Quatre Bras and near Ligny. In order to push in between the Allies to any effect, Napoleon must seize on both these points. The French army broke up June 15th at 3 a.m. Napoleon was full of eagerness and early in the saddle. The French advanced with slight opposition to Quatre Bras and forced the Prussians back to Fleurus. Napoleon remained in the saddle all day, then retired to Charleroi, overcome with a fatigue which seemed to paralyze his mental faculties. He could no longer conquer sleep as of old. His bodily condition was bad, and even the necessity of present success was unable to evoke persistent effort. There is a singular difference between Napoleon at this time and grim old Frederick in 1759 suffering from gout. The king never gave up for an instant his restless work. Disease and pain could not subdue his obstinate diligence. The emperor's ailments overcame his zeal. Here began those little lapses of unused time whose addition, in 4 days, sufficed to bring Napoleon to the end of his career. The plan of campaign was as brilliantly thought out and begun as that of 1796, and with equal vigor would have equally succeeded. Wellington and Blücher had foreseen the maneuver and agreed to concentrate for mutual support at Quatre-Bras and Ligny. But Wellington, instead of holding Quatre-Bras, gave Nivelles as the rallying point. Not even Wurmser or Mack could have made an error more in Napoleon's favor, for this separated him from Blücher, instead of gaining him his support. Napoleon had the chance to strike Blücher singly. Wellington had not yet assembled. Napoleon should have reached Quatre-Bras and Ligny on the 15th, as he could easily have done, or at a very early hour on the 16th. But no orders even were issued till nearly 9 a.m. of the 16th. In his old days, Napoleon would have been at the outposts at daylight, have gauged the situation with his own eyes and his incomparable power of judgment, and would have attacked at an early hour. But he did not reach the ground till noon, nor finish his reconnaissance till 2 p.m. Ney had been sent to Quatre-Bras. Despite delays, however, part of Napoleon's plan did succeed. Wellington was prevented from joining Blücher, and Blücher was beaten and fell back in disorder. Now Napoleon's object was so to maneuver as to keep the Allies apart. This could be done only by immediate pursuit. He must push on after Blücher relentlessly so as to throw him off in an easterly direction, where he could observe him with a small force while he should dispose of Wellington singly. And the more Wellington should manage to push back Ney, the graver danger he would run. Nothing was done about the pursuit of Blücher on the night of 16th to 17th. Next morning, Napoleon leisurely visited the battlefield of Ligny and conversed with his officers about indifferent things. None of the old-time drive was manifest. It was again noon before he ordered Grouchy in pursuit of the Prussians, while he himself would turn against the English. Grouchy got off about 2 p.m. No one knew at that time whether Blücher had retired on Namur or Wavre. In earlier days, Napoleon would have ascertained this fact with his own eyes, for it was the one fact to make no mistake about. Whether to ascertain this was the duty of the staff or the general is immaterial. That Napoleon did not do so may not have been his fault, but it was his misfortune. Great captains have won success by personal activity and by relying only on themselves in critical matters. In estimating a great soldier, one must number all his errors of omission and commission. No general may shelter himself behind the lapse of a subordinate. He must stand or fall by what he himself does or fails to do. But the fate of the campaign was already sealed. Blücher had had the night of the 16th to 17th and the morning of the 17th, and he had used the respite well. He boldly threw up his own base on Liège and marched on Wavre to rejoin Wellington. Napoleon had assumed that Blücher would retire along his line of communications. He desired him to do this, and erroneously calculated on his having done so. The object of breaking the Allied center, the sundering of the Allies so as to beat them in detail, had been forfeited by the 16 or 18 hours of unnecessary delays after the Battle of Ligny. The Battle of Waterloo itself has been so fully and ably discussed from this rostrum, and Grouchy's part of the failure so clearly explained, that I will go no further. It seems clear that the battle was lost on the day preceding it. If Blücher did not join Wellington by one means, he would by another, when Napoleon gave him so many hours' leeway. Nothing but the old activity in following up his initial success could possibly have enabled Napoleon to fight Wellington and Blücher separately, and if they joined, they were sure to beat him. Had he kept right on, he would have beaten Wellington, and Blücher would have retired. His difficulties here were not great. He was successful in his early steps, and failed in later ones. The explanation of the whole matter lies in the fact that Napoleon's physical powers and moral initiative had waned. His intellect was unimpaired, but his character had lost its native quality. No man should be subject to criticism for inability to do his best work when suffering from disease. It is not intended to criticize in this sense. La critique est facile, l'art est difficile. The motto of these lectures is that coexistent intellect, character, and opportunity go to make the great captain. We see Napoleon for 12 years, possibly the greatest soldier who ever lived. We then see his successes lessen. It was not from declining intellect. It was partly lesser opportunity, that is, greater difficulties, partly loss of activity and decisiveness, or in other words, character, proceeding from weakening physique or decrease of moral strength. There may be room for doubt whether failing health alone or failing health combined with waning character caused the indecisiveness. It descends into a question of nomenclature. Of the bald fact, there can be no doubt. Napoleon at Waterloo was not as great as Napoleon at Austerlitz. The secret of Napoleon's power lay in his clear eye for facts, his positive mind. Carlyle says, "The man had a certain instinctive, ineradicable feeling for reality, and did base himself upon fact, so long as he had any basis." Napoleon said of himself that he was most of a slave of all men, obliged to obey a heartless master, the calculation of circumstances and the nature of things. Coupled with this were a reliance on facts, rare capacity for divination, and an immense power of imagination. But finally, the latter overran the other qualities. His successes convinced him that he could do anything. He forgot what his success had been grounded on, and he began to neglect facts. "It is not possible is not French," said he. "This is the best of maxims construed one way, the worst if misconstrued." Napoleon believed himself able to accomplish all things until his accuracy of judgment was lost in his refusal to look facts in the face. He ceased to be slave of the nature of things. He deserted belief in facts for belief in his destiny. Finally, facts became for him not what they were, but what he wished them to be. He refused credit to what did not suit his theory of how things ought to turn. Napoleon had what rarely coexists, an equally clear head on the map and in the field. On the map, he was able in both theory and practice. His theories are textbooks, his letters are treatises. No higher praise can be spoken than to say that every one of Napoleon's 14 campaigns was, in a military sense, properly planned. Napoleon showed the value of masses in strategy as well as tactics. In former times, the worth of troops was of greater value than numbers. Today, worth of itself is less essential than it was. Napoleon founded his calculations on the equality of thousands. It is he who collated all that was done by the other great captains, clothed it in a dress fit for our own days, and taught the modern world how to make war in perfect form. Strategy will always remain the same art. Its uses are today varied by railroads, telegraphs, arms of precision. What was not allowable in the Napoleonic era can be undertaken now with safety. But all this has only modified. It has not changed strategy. The tendency of modern armies is toward better organization. Ramrod discipline is giving way to dependence on the individuality of officers and men, and to instruction in doing what at the moment is the most expedient thing. But every great soldier will be great hereafter from the same causes which have made all captains what they were. In conducting war, he will be governed by the same intellectual and moral strength which they exhibited, and will do, as they always did, what befits the time, unfettered by rules and maxims, but with a broad comprehension of their true value. Napoleon is so close to this generation that he sometimes appears to us gigantic beyond all others. He certainly molded into shape the method in use today, which the Prussians have carried forward to its highest development by scrupulous preparation in every department, personal service, and the teaching of individuals to act with intelligent independence. That Napoleon was always intellectually the equal, and in the first part of his career in the moral forces, the equal of any of the captains, cannot be denied. But we must remember that because Napoleon wrought in our own times, we can the better appreciate what he did, while our more meager knowledge of the others makes it impossible to see as clearly the manner in which, to accomplish their great deeds, they must have patterned their means to the work to be done. The most important qualities of an army leader, says Jomini, will always be a great character or constitutional courage, which leads to great determinations. Sang-froid, or bodily courage which conquers danger. Learning appears in third line, but it will be a strong help. Napoleon exhibited these qualities in full measure up to 1808, and comes close to being, at his best, the greatest of the captains. He failed to exhibit the moral power in as great measure thereafter. It was not years, for Caesar and Frederick were older when they showed these same qualities in the highest degree. That Napoleon lost activity and decisiveness, and thereby forfeited success, is no reproach. No man can keep his faculties beyond a certain period. He lacked that equipoise which enables a man to stand success. He did not last as the others lasted, and proved that only so long as a man retains the highest grade of character can he remain a great captain. At the same time, it is but fair to repeat that the conditions under which Napoleon worked gradually became more difficult, that the Allies learned from him as the Romans did from Hannibal, and made fewer mistakes as the years went on, that he was not always able to retain about him the most efficient of his marshals, that he commanded vastly larger armies than the other captains. His task was larger accordingly. Napoleon's strategy shows a magnificence in conception, a boldness in execution, and a completeness and homogeneity not shown by any other leader. The other captains can only stand beside him because they builded so that he might add. They invented so that he might improve. But while Napoleon reached a height beyond the others, they did not show the decrease of genius which he showed. Too little time is left to draw a satisfactory comparison between Napoleon and his peers in arms. In Frederick, we recognize a man of higher standard than Napoleon reached. Not merely because Frederick was, of all the captains, the only one who, with vastly smaller forces, attacked troops equal to his own and defeated them right and left. In other words, because he was typical tactician, the typical fighter, but because he was steadfast in victory and defeat alike. Because he was so truly a king to his people as well as a soldier, because he so truly merged his own self in the good of Prussia. Napoleon flared like a comet, Frederick burned like a planet or a fixed star, less brilliant, less startling, but ever constant. Frederick, at the close of his life, was the same great man. Napoleon had burned out his lamp. Frederick never waned. Years or infirmity never changed his force or determination, or limited his energies. Moreover, Frederick, like Hannibal, was greater in disaster than in success. Napoleon succumbed to disaster. Frederick and Hannibal alone held themselves against overwhelming civilized armies. They were stronger, more able, more determined, more to be feared, the more misfortune crowded upon them. We instinctively couple Napoleon's genius with his greatest success. We couple Hannibal's or Frederick's with their direst disasters. Alexander and Gustavus never looked real disaster in the face, as Frederick before Leuthen or Hannibal after the Metaurus. Nor indeed did Caesar. But Caesar opposed wonderful countenance to threatening calamity. Looking at Napoleon and Gustavus, it is perhaps impossible to compare them. Gustavus was immeasurably above all the others in purity of character, and their equal in force and intellect. To him we owe the revival of intellectual war, lost for 17 centuries, and on what he did, Frederick and Napoleon builded. Napoleon is nearer akin to Caesar. Perhaps, take them all in all, as soldiers, statesmen, lawgivers, Caesar and Napoleon are the two greatest men. But they sink below the rest in their motives and aspirations. Neither ever lost sight of self. While Alexander's ambition was not only to conquer the East, but to extend Greek civilization, the motive of Hannibal and Frederick was patriotic, and that of Gustavus, love of country and religion. 3 of the captains were kings from the start. Their ambition was naturally impersonal. Of the other 3, Hannibal alone worked from purely unselfish motives. Nor can we compare Napoleon with Hannibal. In his successes, Napoleon is equally brilliant, more titanic. In his failures, he falls so far below the level of this great pattern of patient, never-yielding resistance to adversity as to be lost. To Alexander fighting semi-civilized armies, Napoleon can only be likened in his Egyptian campaigns, and in this he in no sense rises to the height of the Macedonian. Napoleon's genius was most apparent on the familiar fields of Europe. In intellectual grasp, all 6 great captains stand side by side. In enthusiastic activity, and in all the qualities which compel good fortune, Alexander stands clearly at the head. No one but Frederick has perhaps so brilliant a string of tactical jewels as Hannibal, while in a persistent, unswerving struggle of many years to coerce success against the constantly blackening frowns of fortune, Hannibal stands alone and incomparable. Caesar was a giant in conception and execution alike, and stands apart in having taught himself in middle life how to wage war, and then waging in it a fashion equaled only by the other five. Gustavus will always rank not only as the man who rescued intellectual war from oblivion, but as the most splendid character, in nobility of purpose and intelligence of method, which the annals of the world have to show. Frederick is not only the battle captain who never blenched at numbers, but truly the last of the kings, king and priest in the history of mankind. Napoleon carries us to the highest plane of genius and power and success, and then declines. We begin by feeling that here is indeed the greatest of the captains, and we end by recognizing that he has not acted out the part. No doubt, taking him in his many-sidedness, Caesar is the greatest character in history. It may not unfairly be claimed that Napoleon follows next, especially in that he preserved for Europe many germs of the liberty which was born of the blood of the Revolution. Caesar was the most useful man of antiquity. Napoleon comes near to being the most useful man of modern times. But neither Caesar nor Napoleon appeal to us as do splendid, open-hearted Alexander, patient, intrepid, ever-constant Hannibal, the Christian hero, Gustavus, and daring, obstinate, royal Frederick.
This concludes Great Captains by Theodore A, presented by Major Intonio. We hope you've enjoyed this volume. For further, similar audiobooks, visit the Major's YouTube channel or our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.